Welcome to this session exploring the different energy systems in the human body. This module aims to examine the roles of each energy system and how it supplies our body with energy. Before we look at the different energy systems in the body, we need to first understand metabolism. Metabolism is the process by which your body converts what you eat and drink into energy. During this complex biochemical process, calories in food and beverages are combined with oxygen to release the energy your body needs to function. There are two basic metabolic reactions that take place in the human body: anabolic and catabolic reactions. These are the two broad types of biochemical reactions that make up metabolism. Anabolism builds complex molecules from simpler ones, while catabolism breaks down large molecules into smaller ones. A molecule is made up of two or more atoms, which are the smallest fundamental unit of a chemical compound that can take part in a chemical reaction. Atoms make up 99% of the human body and are comprised of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, calcium, and phosphorus. Most people think of metabolism in the context of weight loss and bodybuilding, but metabolic pathways are important for every cell and tissue in an organism. The process of metabolism is how cells are able to get energy and remove waste. Many of the metabolic reactions in the body are associated with the production of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP as is commonly known. Energy is extracted from the foods we eat and is presented in the form of ATP. Now let's take a closer look at the basic physiology behind ATP and energy production. Energy is broken down and stored as ATP when a phosphate is added to adenosine diphosphate, otherwise known as ADP. Energy is released through ATP breaking off a phosphate to form adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. The process of adding a phosphate to ADP is called phosphorylation, so we can say that ADP is phosphorylated to produce ATP. ATP molecules can be recycled over and over again depending on the energy demands of the body. Energy for the body is produced by three main energy systems: the ATP-PC system, the Anaerobic Glycolytic system, and the Aerobic system. Let's start off with the ATP-PC system. As the name suggests, the ATP-PC system incorporates adenosine triphosphate and phosphocreatine into the process of energy production. This energy system provides immediate energy through the breakdown of these stored high-energy phosphates. If this energy system is fully stocked, it will provide energy for maximal intensity, short-duration exercise for between 10 to 15 seconds before it fatigues. Think of the ATP-PC system as the V8 of your energy systems. It provides you with the most power because it produces ATP more quickly than any other system. And because of this, it fuels all very high-intensity activities. Its main downfall, however, is that it burns out very quickly. So how does the ATP-PC system work? There are only a few steps involved in the ATP-PC system, which is why it can provide energy so quickly. Initially, ATP stored in the myosin cross bridges, which are microscopic contractile parts of muscle, is broken down to release energy for muscle contraction. This leaves us with adenosine diphosphate and one single phosphate, which are known as the byproducts of ATP breakdown. Phosphocreatine is then broken down by the enzyme creatine kinase into creatine and phosphate. The energy released in the breakdown of phosphocreatine allows ADP and the phosphate to rejoin, forming more ATP. This newly formed ATP can then be broken down to release energy in order to fuel activity. During the first few seconds of exercise, regardless of intensity, the ATP-PC system is relied on almost exclusively, with energy coming from the breakdown of the ATP stores within the muscles. These ATP stores last only a few seconds, after which the breakdown of phosphocreatine provides energy for another 5 to 8 seconds of activity. Combined, the ATP-PC system can sustain all-out exercise for up to 10 to 15 seconds, and it is during this time that the potential rate for power output is at its greatest. If activity continues beyond this immediate period, the body must rely on other energy systems to produce ATP, as the limited stores of both ATP and PC will be exhausted and will need time to replenish, which takes about 2 minutes of rest to do so. If activity continues at a high intensity, these stores may only partially replenish, as there will not be enough energy available for creatine and phosphate to reform phosphocreatine, and the rate of ATP breakdown through other energy systems will impede the replenishment of ATP stores in the muscle. To develop this energy system, sessions involving repeats of up to 10 to 15 seconds of maximum intensity activity are required, with approximately 2 minutes rest between repeats to allow the system to replenish. There is a more scientific formula for rest periods called the work-to-rest ratio. For the ATP-PC system, this ratio is 1 to 10 or 1 to 12. This means that for every second of work done, you need to allow 10 to 12 seconds for recovery. Some examples of training that focus primarily on the ATP-PC system are lifting the heaviest weight you possibly can for 1 or 2 repetitions, sprinting as fast as you can for 50 to 100 meters with 2 to 3 minute recovery intervals before repeating, punching a boxing bag as hard as you can for 2 to 3 punches. It's important to note that when you design a training session to condition the ATP-PC system, you must build in adequate rest and stop the session if the quality of the movements or the power output decreases significantly. When this happens, you are starting to work on power endurance as fatigue is evident, and that is counterproductive if your goal is purely to increase the ATP-PC system's capacity. For example, if you were training to increase your explosive jumping ability, say for basketball, by jumping as high as you could, you would notice that after 2 or 3 jumps, the next may not get you the same height. You would then stop and rest as your ATP-PC system is depleted. If you continue, you will be starting to train endurance, which will be counterproductive to developing explosive power. This brings us on to the anaerobic glycolytic system. The term glycolysis simply means the breakdown of glucose and consists of a series of chemical reactions that are controlled by enzymes. Think of the anaerobic glycolytic system as the V6 car engine opposed to the V8 of the ATP-PC system. The anaerobic glycolytic system produces a lot of power, but not quite as much or as quickly as the ATP-PC system. However, it has larger fuel supplies and doesn't burn all its fuel as quickly as the ATP-PC system, so it doesn't fatigue as quickly. The contribution of the anaerobic glycolytic system to energy production increases rapidly after the initial 10 seconds of intense exercise. This coincides with a drop in power output as the immediately available phosphagens, ATP and PC, begin to run out. By about 30 seconds of sustained activity, the majority of energy comes from the anaerobic glycolytic system. At 45 seconds of sustained intense activity, there is a second decline in power output. Exercise beyond this point has a growing reliance on the aerobic energy system as the anaerobic glycolytic system starts to fatigue. So how does the anaerobic glycolytic system work? There are 4 key steps involved in the anaerobic glycolytic system. However, they take longer to be carried out compared to the steps in the ATP-PC system. This is why it doesn't start working as quickly, and as these steps are more complex than the ATP-PC system, energy isn't produced as quickly. Initially, stored glycogen is converted to glucose. Glucose is then broken down by a series of enzymes. 2 ATP molecules are used to fuel glycolysis, and 4 are created as a result. So the body gains 2 ATP to use for muscular contraction. The breakdown of glucose to synthesize ATP results in the creation of a substance called pyruvate and hydrogen ions. The muscle becomes increasingly acidic as more hydrogen ions are created. Because this system is anaerobic, there isn't enough oxygen to break down pyruvate and synthesize any more ATP. This results in pyruvate binding with some of the hydrogen ions and converting them into a substance called lactate, which is completely different to lactic acid. Lactate actually acts as a temporary buffering system to reduce acidosis, the buildup of acid in the muscle cell, and no further ATP is synthesized. For a long time, lactate was thought of as the major cause of fatigue and the cause of the burning sensation created in muscles during intense exercise. We now know this to be incorrect, as lactate actually helps performance during intense exercise. Because the hydrogen cannot be removed without the presence of oxygen, the muscle cell becomes increasingly acidic. It is this acidity that we feel as a burning sensation, and it comes about solely as a result of the accumulation of hydrogen ions. If a muscle cell becomes too acidic, the muscle stops functioning as the enzymes that control glycolysis struggle to function in an acidic environment. During high-intensity exercise, pyruvate and hydrogen ions accumulate rapidly, but lactate is formed when one molecule of pyruvate attaches to two hydrogen ions. The lactate is then quickly removed from the muscle cell, protecting the cell from becoming too acidic so exercise can continue for a little longer. However, as intense exercise continues, we reach a point where we cannot remove enough lactate from our muscles to control the acidosis caused by the rapid accumulation of hydrogen ions. And when this happens, we are unable to sustain the intensity of exercise and have to either cease exercise or reduce the intensity. This is why, even with the help of lactate, we can only work at a high intensity for short periods of time. But bear in mind that if lactate wasn't formed, we wouldn't be able to work at high intensity for nearly as long as we can. This is not the only benefit of lactate. The lactate that is removed from the muscle is carried to surrounding muscles that have oxygen available, and also to the liver, where it goes through various chemical reactions that ultimately convert it back to pyruvate and/or glucose for further glycolysis and energy production via the aerobic energy system. Our aim when we train this system is to increase tolerance to lactate, increase the removal of lactate, and improve the rate at which glycolysis produces ATP. This is the type of high-intensity training that burns, as the active muscles become increasingly acidic. The work-to-rest ratios used in this type of training vary depending on the intended outcome. If you want the system to completely recover and clear the majority of accumulated lactate so you can repeatedly condition it, you would use a ratio of 1:6, 6 seconds of rest for every second of work. A ratio of 1:3 can be used in order to create a greater lactate response and carry some of the fatigue into the next set of repeats. This helps to condition the body to clear lactate. With more advanced athletes, a ratio of 2:1 can be used to lactate stack an individual. This ratio causes a progressive accumulation of lactate, as the very small rest interval doesn't allow enough time for much of the lactate to be removed from the muscle, which forces the person to continue to exercise with a lot of lactate present, thus dramatically increasing their ability to tolerate the exercise. So if we wanted to increase the body's capacity, we would use a 1:6 ratio repeated often. If we wanted to train the body to clear lactate, we would use a 1:3 ratio. And if we wanted to teach the body to tolerate lactate, we would use either a 1:1 or 2:1 ratio. Some examples of training that focus primarily on the anaerobic glycolytic system are 3 sets of 10 repetitions of any resistance exercise performed relatively slowly with 5 seconds per rep, with 2.5 minutes rest between sets. This is utilizing the 1:3 ratio. A gym circuit class with 45 seconds on each station and 15 seconds rest to move to the next station. Sprint repeats with 10 repetitions of 30-second sprints as fast as possible with 15 seconds recovery between each sprint. This is utilizing the 2:1 ratio. Finally then, we have the aerobic energy system. The aerobic energy system accesses a massive store of virtually unlimited energy. This energy system utilizes fats, carbohydrates, and sometimes proteins for resynthesizing ATP for energy use. The aerobic system produces far more ATP than either of the other energy systems, but it produces the ATP at a much slower rate, and therefore cannot fuel intense exercise that demands the fast production of ATP. Think of the aerobic system as the big diesel bus with a massive fuel tank, as opposed to the V8 car of the Atpc system and the V6 car of the Anaerobic Glycolytic system. While the aerobic system doesn't produce nearly as much power as the other systems, a major feature is its capacity, which is virtually limitless, as it just keeps on producing ATP. Think of this capacity as the fuel tank of the diesel bus. It is so big that it'll hardly ever run out of fuel. The aerobic system consists of 3 processes or stages, each of which produce ATP. These stages involve more complex chemical reactions than the other energy systems, which is why ATP production is much slower. Because of the more complex the process, the longer it takes to produce ATP. The 3 stages, which we'll look at now in further detail, are aerobic glycolysis, in this case slow glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, which is also known as the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Aerobic glycolysis is exactly the same series of reactions as anaerobic glycolysis, except it just has a different outcome because sufficient oxygen is present. Initially, stored glycogen is converted to glucose, which is then broken down by a series of enzymes. 2 ATP molecules are used to fuel glycolysis, and 4 are created, so the body gains 2 ATP to use for muscular contraction. Pyruvate is created as the end product of the breakdown of glucose, but as oxygen is present, pyruvate is converted into a substance called acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl coenzyme A can then be synthesized in the 2nd and 3rd stages of the aerobic system to create more ATP. The 2nd and 3rd stages of the aerobic energy system continue the breakdown of glucose that was started by aerobic glycolysis and result in the formation of the byproducts carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, and the synthesis of more ATP. These later stages occur in the mitochondria, which are tiny bean-shaped structures located inside the muscle cells. Mitochondria are known as the aerobic power plants, as it is within these power plants that the majority of aerobic ATP is produced. The 2nd stage of the aerobic system, called the Krebs cycle, also deals with acetyl coenzyme A that is produced by aerobic glycolysis. Fatty acids from fats and amino acids from proteins are converted to acetyl coenzyme A through a series of complex chemical reactions. Along with the acetyl coenzyme A from glycolysis, they enter the Krebs cycle and are broken down. This results in ATP production, and the byproducts of carbon dioxide and hydrogen are produced. The hydrogen produced in the Krebs cycle, plus the hydrogen produced during glycolysis, left unchecked, would cause cells to become too acidic. And as we know, acidity in the muscle is what causes the anaerobic glycolytic system to fatigue. In the aerobic system, hydrogen combines with 2 enzymes and is then transported to the electron transport chain. The main purpose of the Krebs cycle is to generate hydrogen to transfer to the electron transport chain, where it can be dealt with in a way that will control acidity and enable the aerobic system to keep synthesizing ATP. So to summarize what happens in the Krebs cycle, acetyl coenzyme A enters the Krebs cycle. Acetyl coenzyme A is then broken down into carbon dioxide, a waste product, and hydrogen. 2 more ATP molecules are synthesized during this process and made available to fuel further muscle contractions. The hydrogen produced as a result is transferred to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is the most complex and productive pathway of the aerobic energy system. It produces 34 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose that is used. Its complexity, however, makes it very hard to understand, so we don't expect you to be an expert. Once in the electron transport chain, the hydrogen ions from the Krebs cycle undergo further chemical reactions. Here, they are combined with oxygen to form the end product of water. The process of transferring hydrogen ions from its carrier molecules to oxygen and having the hydrogen ions move across a chemical gradient produces the energy required to combine ADP and phosphate to form ATP. Just to summarize, the electron transport chain works as follows. Hydrogen ions from the Krebs cycle are carried to the electron transport chain by carrier molecules. These hydrogen ions are then transferred to a carrier molecule embedded in the electron transport chain, where they go through a series of chemical reactions. A hydrogen ion gradient is then created. As hydrogen ions move across this gradient, another form of ATPase adds a phosphate molecule to ADP to form ATP. Water is created as a byproduct when hydrogen combines with oxygen. The ATP gained from the complete breakdown of one glucose molecule in the aerobic system is as follows. Glycolysis produces 2 ATP molecules. The Krebs cycle produces 2 ATP molecules, and the electron transport chain produces 34 ATP molecules. So in total, the aerobic energy system produces 38 ATP molecules. From this, we can see how the aerobic energy system's capacity to generate ATP is virtually limitless. Where the anaerobic glycolytic system synthesizes only 2 ATPs from the breakdown of one glucose molecule, the aerobic system can synthesize 38 ATPs from one molecule, albeit very slow in comparison. This also explains how our capacity for low-intensity endurance activities is so large. Some examples of training that primarily focuses on training the aerobic energy system are running for 2 minutes at a moderate to high intensity, followed by 2 minutes at low intensity active recovery, repeated for 30 minutes. 30 minutes of low to moderate intensity cycling, swimming, or jogging without any change in intensity. A 30-minute jog over some hills, requiring bursts of extra effort every now and then, but never stopping throughout the jog. As we have seen in this module, the body uses the food and beverages we consume to produce energy in a number of ways. At the end of the day, the type of exercise and training we are doing will determine which energy system is being primarily used to fuel us for the activity we are completing. To summarize all that we have gone over in this module, the Atpc system is used for very high intensity, short duration activity and leaves us with a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. The anaerobic glycolytic system is used for high intensity, moderate duration activity and again leaves us with a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. And finally, the aerobic energy system is used for low intensity, long duration activity and synthesizes the most amount of ATP molecules, 38.